good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I thought we'd spend a couple moments going over the semicolon, a pesky little punctuation mark that sometimes gives students a lot of trouble. I always tell students, don't use a semicolon unless you know how to. So hopefully after a few slides you'll have a better grasp on how to use a semicolon correctly. Okay, so unlike the comma, which has many different uses and many different applications, the semicolon only has two basic acceptable uses. So that's nice to know, right? There's only basically two different scenarios where you're going to use a semicolon. The first is when a writer uses it to join closely related independent clauses. Well, this definition is fine and pretty easy to remember, only if the writer can identify an independent clause. So to review, remember, an independent clause has a subject, has a verb, and expresses a complete thought. In other words, an independent clause is basically a sentence. Okay? And the second acceptable use of the semicolon is when a writer uses one to separate items that have internal punctuation. And I'll show you some examples of that. And this is a fairly rare application or use of the semicolon. So basically that's good news, because that means that there's only really one time when you ever need to use a semicolon. Okay, so let's look at how to use a semicolon when we're joining two independent clauses together. Okay? The semicolon as a punctuation mark is stronger than a comma. Okay? So let's think about that for a second. A comma is a pretty weak form of punctuation. Semicolon is a little stronger. So it can be used to join or to link two sentences that are closely related. Now, in this example that I have on this slide, the first example is incorrect, or there's a problem grammatically with it. Graduating high school was a milestone, comma, I was finally an adult. This is a very basic and a pretty serious grammatical error. This is what's called the comma splice. It's called a comma splice because the writer has used a comma to splice or to join two independent clauses. Now, if you remember, I just told you or reminded you that the comma is a very weak punctuation mark. And what this writer has tried to do is join two independent clauses together. He's yoking them together with a weak punctuation mark. The comma, you can't do it. So this is an appropriate time to use the semicolon. Remember, the semicolon is used to join two independent clauses. In other words, two sentences. So if you look at this example, ask yourself, are these two sentences? If the answer is yes, and the ideas in each of the sentences seem closely related, that is to say there's a relationship between the two, as is the case with this one, then you can use the semicolon. So the correct punctuation is in the second example. Graduating high school was a milestone, semicolon. I was finally an adult. Okay, some of you recognize what this is. Lots of you probably don't. When I was growing up, we used to call these seesaws or teeter-totters. Kids these days probably don't play on them very much anymore, but when I was a kid, we used to play on them all the time during recess. Lots of fun. You get on with your buddy, one gets on one side, one gets on the other, and you start bouncing up and down. You can spend all recess or lunch period doing this. And of course, it was a lot of fun if the person you were playing with was about the same weight as you were. And of course, the big joke was when your buddy was lifted up high like this little lad is here, you'd slide off the back and your friend would come crashing down. All right. So what does this have to do with a semicolon? It has everything to do with a semicolon. If you can see where I've placed these kind of orangish, yellowish arrows here, the fancy term for that point upon which that seesaw hinges or pivots is called a fulcrum. There's your vocabulary word for the day. Fulcrum, F-U-L-C-R-U-M. So that fulcrum is that pivoting point upon which that seesaw can go up and down. Does that make sense? The semicolon, when it is being used to join two independent clauses, think of it this way. Think of it as the seesaw. Think about it as though that semicolon is the fulcrum of these two sentences. In other words, what this means is that on the left side of the semicolon, you have to have a complete sentence. On the right side of the fulcrum, you have to have a complete sentence. In other words, there needs to be equal grammatical weight. Does that make sense? On both sides of that semicolon. If you do not have equal grammatical weight, in other words, each side balanced by an independent clause, then you do not have a semicolon. Okay, or you don't use the semicolon. All right. So I hope this illustration might help you remember or give you a way that you can test your sentences. All right. Let's move on. Okay, here's an opportunity for you to quiz yourself. I've given you 5 sentences here, and what you need to do is read through them to yourself quietly. Locate the semicolon. Keep in mind the seesaw or the teeter-totter. Find that semicolon and then determine if you have equal grammatical weight on either side of the semicolon. In other words, do you have a sentence on both sides of the semicolon? Number 1, as I waited at the gate, semicolon, I kept thinking about how the traffic was so busy. Number 2, children can be taught many rules, semicolon. They still need supervision. Number 3, television can be entertaining, comma. It can also have negative effects. Number 4, dark clouds formed, rain came down in torrents. And number 5, semicolons terrify me, nevertheless I must conquer them, period. So in these 5 sentences, you need to determine a couple things. Either is the semicolon use correct, or in the case of sentences 4 and 5, where should a semicolon go? Or should a semicolon go there? And in the case of number 3, you don't have a semicolon, you have a comma there. Is that comma correct? Ask yourself that question. Think about the semicolon and what we've talked about, right? It needs to join 2 sentences. It needs to join 2 complete thoughts. It needs to act as a fulcrum. Do you have equal grammatical weight on either side of the semicolon? All right, let's check our work. Question number 1 was incorrect. Here it was originally. As I waited at the gate, semicolon, I kept thinking about how the traffic was so busy. This is an incorrect use of the semicolon. Find the semicolon, look to the left of it and look to the right of it. Do you have a sentence on both sides? Do you have a complete thought? You don't. As I waited at the gate. That's not a complete thought, is it? What happened as you waited at the gate? You see what I'm saying? So, this is a case where the writer used a semicolon when he should have used a comma. Okay? As I waited at the gate, comma, I kept thinking about how the traffic was so busy. Sentence 2 was correct as it was written. Children can be taught many rules, semicolon. They still need supervision. 2 independent clauses, joined by a semicolon, equal grammatical weight on either side of the semicolon, absolutely correct. Good for you. Number 3, television can be entertaining, comma, it can also have negative effects. This sentence was incorrect. This was an example of the comma splice error. Remember, the comma is weaker than the semicolon. So in this case, the writer has tried to join together basically two sentences with a comma, and the comma's too weak. This is an appropriate application of the semicolon. Okay? So remove the comma, or I should say replace the comma with a semicolon. In doing so, you get rid of that comma splice, and you demonstrate to your reader that you know what you're doing with your punctuation. Sentence 4. Dark clouds formed, rain came down in torrents. This is definitely incorrect. This is a terrible sentence. This is what we call a run-on sentence or a fused sentence. In this case, the writer has joined together two independent clauses, basically two sentences with no punctuation, right? This is wrong 100% of the time, 365 days out of the year, I promise you. So what you have to determine here is, where does the first independent clause end? And where does the second one begin? Because that's where we have to go to that's our location point that we need to go in and fix something. Okay, this is where we do our repair work. So to correct it, we find where that first independent clause ended. Dark clouds formed. Subject, verb. Good. Dark clouds, what did they do? They formed. Subject and verb and a complete thought. So the semicolon comes after that. Dark clouds formed, semicolon. Rain came down in torrents. Now we've corrected the fused or the run-on sentence by putting that semicolon in the only place it could go, which is between the two independent clauses, because it's used to join them, remember? Finally, question number 5. Semicolons terrify me, nevertheless I must conquer them. This was incorrect as well. This, too, is a run-on sentence or a fused sentence. The writer has jammed together two sentences and has not attempted to punctuate it at all. So how do we fix this? Again, go to the end of that first complete thought and put a semicolon there. All right? And then look again. The way you check it always is think back to that seesaw. Okay, think back to that teeter-totter, that fulcrum. Is the semicolon placed in the right position where the writer has equal grammatical weight on both sides? That's the criteria. That's the way you check it. Semicolons terrify me. That's a sentence. Subject is semicolons. The verb is terrify. The direct object is me. Semicolons terrify me. Semicolon. Nevertheless, comma, I must conquer them. This is a pretty sophisticated sentence structure, because you've got a semicolon, you've got a conjunctive adverb in the case of nevertheless, and then the only thing I would draw your attention to is the comma that comes after that kind of transitional, in this case, conjunctive adverb. Okay. Oftentimes I see a sentence like this punctuated incorrectly. Sometimes the writer will put a semicolon after nevertheless, or they'll forget to put a comma after nevertheless, or they'll make it into a big comma splice. They'll put the comma where the semicolon is, and then it's just a big mess. Okay, so again, think about it. This is not difficult stuff, because I know it's not, because I can do it. So think about the teeter-totter. Think about that semicolon and its function. Remember, you've basically got one use of a semicolon. It's to join two sentences. Okay, and the way you check it is you look to the left of that semicolon, and you darn well better have a sentence. You look to the right of that semicolon, you darn well better have a complete sentence. You got to have equal weight on both sides of that teeter-totter if you want to play and have fun, right? Okay. One thing to remember is that punctuation is used by writers always to try to clarify meaning for the reader. Okay, so keep that in mind. You know, sometimes we use a comma to separate items that we list out in a series. For example, this morning for breakfast I had waffles, pancakes, toast, juice, coffee, and water. Right? If we were to write that sentence, we would separate the various items that I've listed out that I had for breakfast, and we'd separate those with a comma. Okay? So this second use of a semicolon is sort of related to that principle, that idea. Sometimes, and again, this is a very rare use of semicolons, and I'll show you why here in a second, simply because we don't often find ourselves in writing situations like this. But we can use a semicolon to separate items that are listed in a series when the items that we're listing out themselves have internal punctuation. Now here's an example. The board elected William Smith, president, Mary Jones, vice president, Randy Cross, treasurer, and Ray Bell, secretary. Wow, see all those commas? It can be very confusing, and it can be difficult to read. So writers can use the semicolon to separate these items out that they're listing, and you see how the various items that we're listing out have punctuation contained within them. And remember what I said at the just a minute ago. The idea for using punctuation is always to clarify meaning. Okay, so we would use a semicolon in this case this way. The board elected William Smith, president, semicolon. Mary Jones, vice president, semicolon. Randy Cross, treasurer, semicolon. And Ray Bell, secretary. So the items that we're listing out have commas in them. And so basically what we're listing out here are board members and the offices to which that they've been elected, right? So the semicolon helps us see clearly where one thing ends, one item ends, and the next one begins. See what I mean? It's a very, very rare application, or very, very rare use of the semicolon. So again, basically all you have to worry about most of the times when you're using a semicolon is, do I have a sentence on both sides of the semicolon? Okay, so don't use a semicolon unless you know how to use one, right? And the good news is now you know. So, or if it scares you to death, well, just stay away from it, okay? And rewrite the sentence in another way. But don't use a semicolon just because you think it looks pretty or you think it works there. Right? I mean, part of becoming a skilled writer is to know how to express yourselves and how to clarify your meaning through proper punctuation. So again, I'm all about bringing you good news, and so the good news is simple. If the semicolon scares you, don't use it. All right. But then again, if you are going to use it, know how to use it. And again, only two basic uses, and one of them is extraordinarily rare. So you basically only have one situation writing where you need to use the semicolon. Think about the seesaw, think about the fulcrum, think about grammatical weight, think about sentences on either side, because that's what you're doing, okay? 99.9% of the time, if you're writing and you use a semicolon, you're using it to join together two sentences. And normally it's because those two sentences have a very close relationship to one another. The ideas that are contained in both of the sentences are just closely related, okay? See the handbook section, P3, in a writer's reference, the 7th edition. That's the edition we're in now. I think we're coming to another edition pretty soon. Again, if you have questions, let me know. I'm looking forward to seeing fewer and fewer semicolon errors. Have a great day. See ya.